to Great Moments in Orchestral History. This is our 5th episode. Might be difficult to tell with our lighting, but those trees out there aren't full of billowing leaves anymore. They've withered up and the sky is just plain white. It's a plain white sheet. And maybe that's appropriate because today we're going to look at some music that, is a sort of a descendant of a dispute between Russia and Sweden from their Great Northern War of this is 1700 basically. So, and how does that relate to Finnish composer John Sibelius? Well, I'll tell you. Peter the Great was the Tsar of Russia at this time, and probably got that nickname the Great because he expanded so much of their territory. Russia, for a long period of time, wanted to not be so landlocked. If you look at it, it's a country where the soil isn't necessarily very fertile in a lot of the places, and so there's even folk tales from Russia where there are imaginary seas and rivers and ports of Novgorod and other places that really don't exist at all. So I don't know if these people were just freezing and hallucinated them or what, but so it was a long time coming that Russia wanted to have access to a port so that it could exchange goods and whatnot with the rest of Europe and the rest of the whole world, essentially. And so Peter the Great was able to do this when they captured a fortress that was Sweden's, and then turned that into St. Petersburg in 1703. So then fast forward, to the next century, and John Sibelius is growing up in Finland, but at the time, Finland, like some other countries in the 1800s, like Germany or Italy, weren't necessarily countries. They were different provinces, states that weren't necessarily unified for political or economic or other purposes. So in Finland, there was sort of two different cultures and languages that had not necessarily been integrated so well necessarily into one identity. So in Finland you had the more cosmopolitan people, which included, even though Sibelius grew up in a smaller town, his family was Swedish speaking, and the more cosmopolitan folk spoke Swedish, whereas the Finnish language at this time represented a sort of more rural and peasant tradition, which had its own folk tales and its own folk music traditions. So what drew him to be interested in Finnish culture? Well, can you guess? His girlfriend, yeah. So if I back up just a little bit, Sibelius eventually went to Helsinki to study law and then gave that up and studied the violin, and then that transitioned mostly into composition. And it was after that he met a Finnish young woman, and they became engaged. And her family and her ancestry was Finnish, and it was through her that he became endeared to this folk tale tradition, the Finnish language. So it was after he finished his studies in Helsinki that he was able to get funding from the Finnish government to study in Germany. And he didn't necessarily, like when Beethoven first went to Vienna, he didn't necessarily learn a lot from his teachers, but he had access to other arts. He was just able to be in an environment where music was flourishing, and so he was able to learn by going to see Wagner operas a lot of the time, which made a big impression on him. And he was also able to, it was also around the time that he unfortunately started up drinking and smoking on the more heavy side of things, and that continued and became overwhelming for him later in his life. But nevertheless, he was able to really invest in being in Berlin. And then a year after that, I think we're talking around 1890 or so now, he's in Vienna, and and it's there where his studies become even more serious, and he becomes more and more interested in the orchestral tradition and the fact that his musical priorities might be better suited for the orchestral tradition. Because now when we look back on him, we mostly recognize him as a symphonic composer, because he's interested in pure sound, not just form, not just motive, but like how he can sculpt sound and emotion, and the symphony orchestra was an appropriate canvas for that. So it's in that period of time that he starts to develop his identity and his craft, and just become more successful as a composer through multiple times trying to integrate this Finnish tradition with a more learned German symphonic tradition that he's getting more and more comfortable within. And so why is it that Russia comes into play? Well, at this point in time, since the early 1800s, Finland wasn't a country, let alone a state. It was governed by Russia, and it was around this time that Sibelius was coming into his own that Tsar Nicholas II of Russia doubled down on control of Finland. He ordered a Russification of Finland in this is the early 1900s now. So certain things that might be more visibly Finnish were banned or censored, or people were, sent away, just anything that was a threat. So it was at the turn of the century in 1900 when Sibelius was starting to get some international reputation. A few of his pieces had been published by the major publishing house in Leipzig, Breitkopf and Hüttel, which was Beethoven's publisher. So his music was starting to get known. He was not just being successful locally and stirring some pride locally, but he was starting to get some better reviews from Germany. He had a very delightful interaction with Richard Strauss when he was there. So it's at this point in time, and we're talking, this is right around the Russification that Tsar Nicholas II is doing in Finland, that he's able to go on tour with Finland's Helsinki Philharmonic Orchestra. They're playing his national pride composition, Finlandia, which incorporates this hymn that talks of Finland awakening, and his very first symphony. And so he was able to make quite an impression, both in terms of the success of the orchestra, his compositions, but also in introducing Finland to new audiences, and to perhaps to some empathy in terms of their preference for gaining independence from Russia. Certainly it's not for a little bit more time that they gain independence from Russia, but gaining independence is not necessarily always so instantaneous. It takes time, a certain progression of shifting attitudes and changing conditions. So Sibelius, although no single composition of his led to freedom all by itself, he's certainly seen as a national hero and somebody who was responsible in a way for uniting Finland, because how can a country or a population gain independence with it within itself isn't even unified? That reminds me of the United States now. How can the United States gain its independence from Russia when Americans aren't even in agreement over what American is? I mean, that's a very general term, or they're not in agreement over the fact that there's Russian, whatever have you. Certainly, maybe his whole body of work and his situation is a great moment in orchestral history, but I can make that argument for this second symphony as well. Whereas the first symphony was not necessarily so prophetic, it's the second symphony that arguably, Sibelius wouldn't necessarily endorse this idea, but basically forecasts a victory for Finland it's more towards the end of the symphony that we really see the dealing with the conflict that he introduces and that he's reflecting on in society, and really transforms it in his music. At the beginning of the symphony, it's just a little bit more, it starts off just beautifully, and some folks would have thought of this as being more pastoral, the countryside of the nation. So let's just listen to a little bit of this introduction to his second symphony. Like Beethoven does in his Fifth Symphony, Sibelius decides to have a direct transition from his third movement into the final fourth movement. You could make all kinds of metaphors of, the darkness transitioning into the light. The music becomes transformed in this amazing way. Not necessarily talking about anything political at this moment, but just in terms of what he's able to do in terms of having multiple musical ideas, having them sort of wrestle with each other and then transform into something new that is climactic and hopeful, is something that's certainly, it's a simple idea, it's a nice idea, but the way he pulls it off musically is very impressive. So that's why this particular moment within the symphony is something that's known and recognized for being a great moment. It's also a moment where a conductor is felt to be very relevant and helpful because he's just dealing with so many different lines of music, each doing different active things at different times within the measure. The tempos they're getting faster, they're getting slower, they're changing immediately. So it's quite a moment. Here it is. I have to thank the students at Andrews University for performing this. I mean, they did a great job. Hello, if any of you guys are there. So they performed this piece, and it was quite an experience. After this beginning of the last movement, as Sibelius often did, what he did is usually in a sonata form within a symphony. It's very common to have the second of two themes be in a specific key, usually a major key. But what he wanted to do, and what he decided to often do in his sonata forms, is to use a melody that was reminiscent of one of these Finnish folk tales, and that it was pretty simple. It was in a minor key, using often just a few notes, and that was sort of his trademark of putting in some Finnish character into his symphony, doing something unexpected, and then him having to deal with it in a way that would weave it into the symphony in a compelling way. And he certainly does that in this symphony with his second theme. And so one of the moments of transformation and possibly political prediction and forecasting is when he takes that theme later on when it comes back, and it just builds and builds and builds, and then it turns into music, the same pattern, but in a major key. So this is sort of thought of as being perhaps the most victorious and climactic moment of the symphony. I mean, there are multiple of them. It's a symphony that goes up and down quite a bit, very emotional. It's quite a fabric. But so this moment is where we can see that Finnish identity in his music, and that's that Finnish element that rises up and becomes victorious. One of the things that's great to me about this symphony, about this composer, about his work and his context, is just the role of the composer in society. It's kind of hard to imagine nowadays, like one composer and their work or a certain piece of music having traction politically or in terms of the dialogue and the climate of the entire nation. It wasn't only unique to him, you know. In Italy, we have the Unification of Italy movement, and the operatic composer Giuseppe Verdi having a very significant role in that, and in fact, his operas oftentimes being metaphors for the unification and the claim to the land of Italy, which became, it was 1871, so around the same time that came to fruition. In the 20th century, we see composers being used in some cases for propaganda. We have the usefulness of Shostakovich, depending on the piece, for communist Russia. It was a very complicated relationship. Hopefully we can look at that another time if I get that on my conducting schedule anytime soon. Or even in the US, you have Aaron Copland writing Appalachian Spring, fanfare for the common man in 1944 at the tail end of the war. And part of it is like, I mean, maybe I'm suggesting the wrong question. I don't know whether it's even desired for a composer to have that kind of visibility and political persuasion or usefulness, because, should we be using their music that way? Would it be fair of us to expect a composer to be able to galvanize a population and an idea and to be compelling enough to sort of even change the focus and the discourse of an entire country? Man, that seems pretty unlikely, but it has happened before. We've seen it happen before. It's a completely different age, though. I mean, now, in a globalized world, in a digital world, maybe the way that music can relate to a population is just very different, and these are different times. So who knows what the usefulness or the perspective of a composer is going to continue to be as we go into the future. I'm only a conductor, and maybe some other things as well. So I'm not going to be necessarily shaping these future compositions and these situations. But yeah, we don't know. I don't know what's going to be written, performed, and all that into the future. But hopefully there could at least be the opportunity for somebody to have an impact, and hopefully of one of their choosing. But we look forward to it. We look forward to future great moments.